Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Power Query and Power Pivot in Excel. I've done a couple of sound checks already. I just saw there was a couple of people in the comments saying they can't hear anything. That's normal. You can't hear anything unless I'm doing a sound check, so it's dead silent. I wish we had some music, but unfortunately they don't have that utility in this software. So hopefully everybody can hear me now. Really exciting to be back with you all. I tend to do these sort of once every 2 weeks now, so there's always a little bit of a break, but it is lovely to get back onto a webinar. And this topic is a new topic for us. I don't think we've done this one before. I think I've only trained it in person once before, and that is Power Pivot and Power Query. Please don't worry if you've never heard of either term. We're going to start right at the beginning. As always, I'm not going to assume that you know anything about either of these utilities. As always at the start, I just do like to introduce myself very briefly. I know a lot of you attend our webinars all the time, but we always do have some new people on here as well. So very quickly, my name's Deborah Ashby, and I'm going to be hosting the session today. I'm an IT trainer and subject matter expert for Microsoft products, and I work at Filtered and Excel with Business, and I'm basically responsible for all of the Microsoft content that we offer. So that's courses, I run webinars, write blogs, do everything Microsoft related. And as you can see there, just from my credentials, I've been doing this for a fairly long time, 22 years in the IT industry, and just coming up to 10 years in IT training. So hopefully that qualifies me to be running this webinar today. I'll let you be the judge of that. Before we jump into the content, I just want to go through a couple of little version constraints. So the session that we're running today, Power Query and Power Pivot, you should be absolutely fine if you have Excel version 2010 onwards. So that's 2010, 2013, 2016, or 2019, which has just come out now. So you should be okay if you have any of those versions. Also Office 365 as well. Now, the purpose of the session today is really just to introduce you to Power Query and Power Pivot so that you understand what these utilities do and how they might be able to help you in your daily work. Both of these, both Power Query and Power Pivot, are huge topics, and there is no way that we could cover absolutely everything in the sort of 45 minutes to an hour or so that we have. So the idea of this session is really just to give you a taster, and then you can decide if that's a topic you'd like to delve more into. And as always, we do have courses available for you to purchase on our website if you decide that you want to go a little bit further in depth with it. And another small little caveat at the start, I'll say this now, I am by no means a Power Pivot expert, as it kind of breaches the bounds of Excel and veers more into the database arena. But I know enough about it, and I've seen enough to know that how it can be helpful to you, and I can definitely show you how you can get started with it. So let's start out by taking a look at our agenda. So we're going to start by just talking briefly about what exactly is Power Query and Power Pivot. I'm then going to jump into pivot tables because it's really important that you do understand the basics of pivot tables, and you may have attended one of our pivot tables sessions previously. I'm going to do a very quick reminder. We'll create a very quick pivot table which will help you understand what Power Query and Power Pivot is. We'll then import some data using Power Query, or the Get and Transform utility as it's called. I'm going to show you how you can tidy up data and clean it using Transform, and also how you can perform calculations within the Power Query window. We're then going to take a look at how you can add to the data model and create relationships between tables. And then finally, we're going to create a Power Pivot table. And this will probably mean nothing to you at the moment if you've never come across Power Query and Power Pivot, but hopefully by the end of the session you'll be a little bit more on board with the terminology that we use. I'm just quickly going to check the chat panel because I can see that it's flashing at me, which means there's a few little comments coming in. Yeah, there's people asking if they'll be able to access the recording afterwards. Yes, and I do give a lot of information about this at the end. The recording of these webinars goes out automatically 24 hours after the webinar ends. So sort of by this time tomorrow, you should receive an email from us which will give you the links to the webinar recording. So please look out for that. If you don't get it, I would say please do check your junk folder, your spam folder, or your clutter folder if you're using Outlook, because sometimes our emails do go into there. So please be aware of that. And if you still don't get it, then feel free to send me an email. And as I said, I will give you all my details at the end of this webinar. Hopefully that answers your question. All right, so let's start out by talking about what exactly is Power Query. And I want to focus on this point first and make this super clear. And to make it clear, I think it's best if we create a very quick pivot table, just so to help you understand what Power Query is. So I'm going to jump out of my presentation and jump across to our example spreadsheet that we're going to be using today. Now, oh, I can see I've accidentally typed something in there. Let's just fix that. Okay, so this is our source data. Now, what we have here is just some very basic sales data for two fashion stores in Australia, so Glam Rags and Style Studio. And this is data I use all the time. Again, if you come to some of our webinars, this will probably look fairly familiar. And it's sales data. So we have in column A, we just have the month. We then have the financial year. We have the store. We then have some location information, suburb, state, postcode, and country. We then have the manager in column H, the category, the buyer, and then finally the sales total in that last column. And this data isn't too large. If I do control down arrow, which will jump me to the very last row of my data, you can see I have approximately 4,500 rows. So it's fairly sizable, but not crazy large, shall we say. I'm going to do control up arrow just to jump back up to the top. Now, I've already cleaned up this data, and I'm not going to run through how I did that. And when I say clean data, what I mean is that before you create anything like a pivot table or a pivot chart, you really need to take a look at the data that you're going to be using, and in this case, this data here, and make sure that it's consistent, it doesn't have any blank rows, it's formatted correctly, all of those kinds of things. And there's loads of utilities within Excel which will help you clean your data. We do run a webinar specifically on cleaning data, and we do have it available, the recording of the last one that we did, on our website. And again, at the end of this session, I will give you the link so that if you want to go back and review that, you absolutely can do it. I'm not going to cover it in the session today. So I've already cleaned this data. And what I've basically done is I've just made it consistent. I've removed blank rows, I've removed duplicates, and I've also put it into a table, which is something I always do when I have some source data. And you can tell it's in a table because a few reasons really. I've got these little drop down arrows at the top, these little filters, which they automatically appear when you put your data in a table. And all you do, if you have data and you want to put it into a table, just click anywhere in the data, and then from the home ribbon, you have your format as table drop down, and selecting any of these will basically put your data into a table, which is all I've done here. So this is now in the perfect format for creating just a regular pivot table. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to click in my data, and I'm going to go to the insert ribbon. And my first option is pivot table. So I'm going to click pivot table. And if you're used to creating pivot tables, this is fairly straightforward, but if you're not, let's just run through it very quickly. So it's saying to me, select the data that you want to analyze. And by default, it's automatically picked up the data where I'm clicked. So I don't know if you can see around the outside of my data, I have the little marching ants, okay? So it's picked up all of that data, and that's exactly what I want to use. You could modify this selection if you wanted to, if it didn't pick it up quite correctly. It's then asking me, where do you want the pivot table report to be placed? So I'm going to place it on a new worksheet, which I already have selected by default. And I'm going to click on OK. So this is the basics of a pivot table. So now what it's done is you can see here on the right-hand side, it's pulled through all of those column headings from my source data. And currently my pivot table report is blank. I then have underneath here on the right hand side 4 little areas, and depending on where I drag and drop these headings, that's how my pivot table is going to look. Okay, so let's just do something very basic. I'm going to take the sales information and I'm going to drag it down and put it in values. I'm then going to take the state information and I'm going to drag it down and put it in rows, and you'll see it starts to build my pivot data in the rows, and then we have our values. This is the sum of sales by state. So if that's what I was looking for, if I wanted to know how many sales there had been per state, this is the perfect pivot table. Maybe I then decide that I want to look at my data in a slightly different way, and maybe I want to break it down and look at it by manager. So I could grab my manager field and I could put that maybe underneath the state. And you can see now it's broken it down by state and then by manager. And you can really just move these fields around and get your pivot table to look in all different kinds of ways. Some of them are better than others, but that is the basics of a pivot table. It allows you to pivot those fields around. Super flexible for analyzing data and really drawing out what you're looking for. Okay, does everybody understand that basic concept of a pivot table? Just type into the chat panel if you say yes, or give me a thumbs up or some indication. Yes, yes, and I'm just going to take a quick sip of my drink. Perfect, thank you guys, great. Let's move on. So now we've got that concept. Now, with a pivot table, and you're probably thinking, well, how does this relate to Power Query and Power Pivot? Well, what Power Query will allow you to do is import and use data from multiple sources and combine it into one pivot table. So with a regular pivot table, like we've just done, my source data, I just have one source. This is my source data. If I had other tabs which had other tables on it, I can't combine them into the same pivot table. This is where I would use Power Query and then create a Power Pivot table. Okay, so it's basically when you have large amounts of data in multiple different sources and you want to combine them all into one pivot table. This is where you would use Power Query. Okay, I have a little example to show you. If I jump across to my Dimension Data tab, you can see here I have four different tables. They're all in the same spreadsheet, but they might be on different worksheets. They might be in different files altogether, but I've got them on one spreadsheet. And here I have some product information. I have some customer information in this table. I have some shipping information and then some order information over here. So if I wanted to combine all of these into one pivot table, that is where I would use Power Query and a Power Pivot table, okay? Which is basically what we're going to do. Another cool thing with Power Query, and you'll see this in a moment when we sort of open it up and use it, is that it contains cleanup tools. So you can essentially import large amounts of data from multiple different sources and clean all of the data using one utility. And one of the biggest advantages with both Power Query and Power Pivot is that it can handle a lot more data than a regular pivot table, up to 100 million rows of data. Now, if you tried to do a pivot table in Excel with 100 million rows of data, I guarantee you're going to have problems. It's going to hang, it's going to crash, we're going to get the horrible little spinny thing before it all turns disastrous. That is when you would use Power Query and Power Pivot. They're specifically designed to work with very, very large data sets. Okay, so if you are struggling with your data, it's worth importing it into Power Query and doing your pivot tables that way. So we're going to take a look at all of those things. We're going to see how we can clean data in Power Query and also how we can create a Power Pivot table as well. I'm just going to delete this pivot table because we don't need it. I just wanted to show you that as an example. So let's delete that out and go back to our source data. Now, a couple of things that you'll need to install and turn on before you can use these utilities. So if we talk about installing Power Query, first of all, you should already have it. It's under the data ribbon, and it's this little group here where it says get and transform data. Okay, this little button just here, this is where you can import data. And this is really how you get it into Power Query, okay? Now I'm using 2016, so my button here says Get Data. I think if you're using an older version, so 2013 or 2010, the button is named something slightly different. I think it's called Get and Transform Data, or it might be just Transform, one of the two, but it is basically the same button, so don't allow that to confuse you, okay? So this is where we're going to go to import our data from different sources into Power Query. When it comes to doing the Power Pivot, which we're going to do afterwards, you need to turn on that add-in. It's an add-in. And you can see here I have a ribbon called Power Pivot at the top here. Okay, so if you don't see that in your Excel, I'm just going to show you very quickly how you turn that ribbon on. Okay, and it's a little add-in. So we're going to go to File, and we're going to go down to Options. And you'll see here in our Excel options, we have a section for add-ins. And right at the bottom where it says Manage, we want to switch this to COM add-ins and click Go. And this is where you want to make sure you have this option ticked, Microsoft Power Pivot for Excel. So if you don't see it, you'll find that you don't have a check in that box. So just turn that on, and once you've checked the box, you'll find that this ribbon will then appear. And once you have that, you're then good to go for Power Pivot. Does that make sense to everybody so far? Don't worry, you are getting the recording in case you need to go back and backtrack. Yes, got it. Lovely. Fantastic. You're still with me. Haven't fallen asleep yet. Great. Okay. Right, let's go and import some data into Power Query, and then we can have a look at how we can utilize it to clean that data. So I'm going to, let's go on to a brand new blank tab. So I'm just going to click on the plus to go to a new sheet, and I'm going to go to the data ribbon just here. Now I'm going to import 3 files, and if I quickly jump across to File Explorer, these are the 3 files that I'm going to import. So I just have these saved off in one of my folders, and it's basically sales data for 2014, 2015, and 2016. And these are in a .csv format. So these are comma separated value files. So that all it means are the fields are separated by commas as opposed to being in an Excel format. But you might have Excel spreadsheets, you might have a slightly different format, but I have CSV files which I'm going to use, and I want to import all of these into Power Query, and then I'm going to use the utilities to clean up my data. I'm just going to show you a few little tricks that you can use. Now, a way that I like to do this is if I have them in a folder like this, I like to just copy the path. So I like to highlight and do a Control-C. I'm just going to minimize. And then on my data ribbon, if I go to Get Data, I like to say From File and then From Folder. And it's asking me for the folder path. So this is where I can now just do a Control-V to paste in that path that I copied. That's not the only way. You could click on Browse and browse for it that way, but I actually find it a little bit quicker just to do it this way. So I'm giving it my folder path, and I'm going to click on OK. And this can sometimes take a few seconds just while it pulls through those files. Oh, there we go, a little bit quicker than I thought. And you can see here it's telling me, okay, we've got these 3 files, 2014, 2015, 2016, and it's just giving me a little bit of information on these files, for example, the path. And I'm going to say, yep, those are the ones I want. And at the bottom, I'm going to select Combine and Edit. I think it's Combine and Edit. Let's have a look. Yes, Combine and Edit. And again, it's going to go away and take a look at those files. And what it will do is it will bring you back a preview of the data in those files. So you can see here it's saying, okay, this is the first file. So this is going to be the one for 2014. And it's shown me a preview of what we have in that file. So it's picked up the file origin, it's picked up the delimiter. So if you remember, my files were CSV. So they were, all of these fields in my file were separated by commas. So it's basically said, okay, wherever there's a comma, I'm going to put it in a new column. So it's separated out my data really nicely for me. And it's saying, okay, I've based my detection of the data type in each column based on the first 200 rows. And that's what it's showing me here. All right, so I want to have a quick look, make sure that that looks pretty much okay. And if I'm happy with it, I'm just going to click on OK to load my options into Power Query. And what it will do is it will go away and it will open up those files in a new window. And this is the Power Query Editor window. And this is essentially separate to Excel, and it has its own language and all different kinds of things. And as I said, this is a huge topic, and if it's something that you think might be useful, if you're someone who deals with very large data sets, this might be a topic that you want to go a lot further into than what we're going to today, because as I said, it does have its own language and lots of different utilities that you can use. So let's make sense of what we have in here. So if we look in this first column, we've got source name. So I can see all of my data is coming from these files. And if I click the drop down, I can see it's only showing me 2014 at the moment, even though I did import 3 files. So I'm going to say load more. And it's then showing me, okay, we've got all of that data in there. Okay, and if I scroll across, I can see that I have all of my data in these nice, easy to use columns. What I have on the left-hand side, this is just basically telling me that the query that I've run. So I've basically told Excel, use Power Query and import these 3 files. That's basically just keeps a log of the queries that you've run in the left-hand side. And then if we look over on the right-hand side, this shows you all of the steps that you've applied to your data in this main window. So you'll see as we start to do some editing and some formatting of this data, you'll see it show in this applied steps area. So it's quite good if you need to backtrack or undo a step. So say you do something and you think, oh, I don't want to do that. You can just click on the cross and it will kind of backtrack. So it's essentially the same as doing an undo in Excel. Okay, it's just showing you your applied steps. Now, another thing that will be a little bit familiar to you in here is the ribbon structure. So this does follow that Microsoft ribbon structure. So at the top we have File, Home, Transform, Add Column, and View. Okay, so that should look reasonably familiar to you. All right, so let's take a look at our data, and I just want to show you a couple of things which you can do to sort of clean up your data and manipulate it very slightly within Power Query. Now I'm going to put this data, because it's 3 files combined, I want to create, my goal is to create a pivot table, one pivot table that contains all of this data. So I want to make sure that my data is clean and I'm removing any data that doesn't belong in the pivot table. So looking at this, if I scroll across, what data, can anybody think, what data here might not really be useful in the pivot table? If you look across at my columns, so we've got source name, order ID. Is there any data? You can type it into the chat panel if you can think what that might be. Any data that might not be all that useful? And I'll keep it here, just so you, because it is on this section. Let's have a look. Yes, Alfred, wonderful. Source name, perfect. That data is not going to be particularly useful in a pivot table. It's not very often that I'm going to want to look at the file name. I'm more likely to want to be able to do things like look at how many sales per salesperson, or how many order IDs per salesperson, or the product number by customer, or something like that. I'm not really going to want to look at this source name. So this is a column I could do without, and I can very easily remove it just by highlighting it. And to highlight a column, you just click in the column heading. And if I right click, I have the option to remove, and it just removes it from the Power Query window. Okay, so that's something you can do. So don't be afraid to remove any of your columns. Now, a few other things that you can do is you can do calculations in here. So let's take a look at something a little bit different. You can see here that I've got, if I scroll across, I have order quantity in this column, unit sale price, and also a discount here. Okay, I also have shipping amount, but what I don't have is the actual total. So if we were to multiply the order quantity by the unit price and then minus the discount, that would kind of be the total for each item. So maybe I want to add a column which works out that for me before I put it into a pivot table. And you can do things, you can do little calculations within this Power Query editor as well. So I just want to show you how you can do that. So the calculation I want to do is basically order quantity multiplied by unit price, and then I want to minus the discount. Okay, and this is going to be a little, when I first saw this, I thought, oh, that's a bit difficult to get your head around because you're so used to working in a certain way in Excel. You have to bear in mind that you're not really in Excel at the moment, so this is going to work slightly differently. Okay, but bear with me. What you want to do is, first of all, highlight all of the columns that are going to be part of the calculation. And to highlight multiple, if you just hold down your control key as you click. So all three of these are going to be part of my calculation. And what I want to do is I want to add another column, which is going to basically where my formula or my multiplication is going to be. So if I go up to my ribbons at the top, you can see I have an add column ribbon. Okay. And then in this from number group, I have a series of calculations that I can do, and it's just showing me two that I can do currently. So I want to multiply. And you'll see it's added a column, it's called it multiplication, and it's basically multiplied together all of the columns that I highlighted. So it's multiplied order quantity by unit sell price by discount. Now that's not quite right. What do I actually want to do? What are we going to need to do here? Does anybody know? If it's multiplied all three of these, what do we really want to do instead? Does anybody know? Can't see anybody. Yes, we want to subtract the discount. Very good, yes. So we've multiplied all of these, but we actually only want to multiply order quantity by unit sell price, and then we want to minus the discount, okay? So we have to make a slight modification to what we have in this multiplication column, all right? And this is where we start to get into database commands. This is why I said we're not going to go too much into this because it can get a little bit confusing. But I just want to show you something, a way that you can do it very quickly. So what I'm going to do is, with this column highlighted, I'm going to look just above where this formula is. And again, this does look a little bit different to any Excel formulas that you might come across. So you can see here we have in this formula bar, it says table, add column, and then it says we've done a multiplication and on each list, and then it lists out what we've done. So we've multiplied the order quantity, unit sell price, and discount, okay? What we actually want to do is we want to tell this formula, we actually want to minus this discount. And this seems a little bit backwards, but if you click in front of discount and do 1 minus and then hit enter, that will actually work that out for you, okay? What you can then do is, if you want to round up, round down, again, you can highlight that column, and you have utilities on these ribbons which will allow you to round down, round up, and do lots of other things to format your data. One thing I will say to be careful of, because I do this all the time, is if I want to round down these numbers, so say I want to round down the numbers we have here to 2 decimal places, I always go to, I think, oh, okay, there's my rounding button, and then I try and do it that way, forgetting that I'm clicked on the add column button. If I was to do this, if I was to go rounding and then do round, and then say to 2 decimal places, it's going to give me an additional column. So if I scroll across, it's going to give me a rounded column just here. I don't want the new column, so I'm going to delete it. What I really want to do is I just want to round what we have in this column. So be careful where you click. You don't want to be on the add column ribbon. You want to be on the transform ribbon, where you also have a rounding button. So I always make this mistake, which is why I'm highlighting it to you. I'm going to click round, and then I'm going to say 2. And then we should find that it rounds it correctly in that column, and it doesn't give me an additional column. I might also then want to make this column a little bit more meaningful. So currently it says multiplication, and I'm going to change that. So I'm going to double click and we're going to call it sales, sales amount, like so. Oh, do that again. Lovely. Now, I don't know if you're noticing, as I'm working through this and doing different things, if you look over to the right-hand side in that applied steps pane, it's telling me all the steps that I've done. So if I wanted to go back a step, so say I wanted to go back to and rename the column, I could click on the little cross next to where it says renamed columns, and that will take me back to it saying multiplication. Okay, I could go back further if I wanted to and remove these. So as I said, it's like doing an undo. So I'm just going to go back and change that back to sales amount, like so. All right, hopefully that's making a little bit of sense. So this is sort of, you know, where you can kind of utilize all of these utilities. As I said, we're not going to go through loads and loads of them, but it is worth having a little further read if you do deal with large amounts of data. So some other things that we can do, we've got our sales amount there now, and I'm going to move this next to discount because I personally feel that I want to see it next to discount. It makes a little bit more sense. So I'm going to drag and drop the column by just clicking on the heading and dragging it across, and you can see where you're going to drop it because you get the green line. So I'm going to drop it next to discount just to move that sales column across. I'm going to do the same with, where are we? Order date and ship date. So I want ship date to be next to order date. So I'm going to scroll back across, grab my ship date, and I'm going to drag it all the way across. Oh, and there we go, and place that next to ship date like so. All right, so don't be afraid to drag and drop and move those columns around. Let's do another little calculation so you can see something else in action in this Power Query window. I might want to have a column which shows me or calculates how long it takes to ship these products. So I can see here we have order dates and then when that product's going to be shipped. So if I do a visual check, I can see that there's a 2-day difference between the order date and when it's going to ship. So I might want to add a column which is going to tell me that that's 2 days in here. Okay, so again, what we would do is we would highlight the columns that we want to use in the calculation. All right, and it's really important which order you highlight your columns in. So I'm going to show you both ways. So if I highlight order date first, hold down my control and highlight ship date, I want to add another column. So I'm going to go to the Add Column ribbon. And I want to do, we're dealing with dates here. So in the dates drop down, we have a subtract days. And it's going to give me a column that looks like this. And you can see here it says -2, which isn't quite right. I just want it to say 2 because that's the difference between these two dates. And the reason why it's saying -2 is due to the way that I highlighted these columns. So I highlighted order date and then ship date. So it's going to subtract the order date from the ship date, and I need to do it the other way around. Okay, so I'm going to backtrack out of there by using my applied steps pane and clicking on the cross to undo that. I'm going to go back and I'm going to highlight my shipping date first. Hold down control and then highlight order date, and I'm going to do it again. So I'm going to go to add column, date, subtract days, and there we go. And now I have it looking as I would want it to look. And I'm going to rename this column just by double clicking, and we're going to call this days to ship, like so, and then hit the enter key. Okay, and then I might want to drag that so it's nearer to the information that it's relevant to. So we'll drag across and I'm going to put it just there, like so. All right, so you can really kind of get in there and manipulate your data prior to putting it into some kind of pivot table. Another thing I would advise you to do before you load it into Power Pivot is just to have a quick visual check of the data types. This is quite an important step. So what Power Query will do is when it looks at your data and when it imports it in, it will make its best guess at the kind of data that you have in that particular column. And you can see what data type it's using because it will have this little icon next to the column heading name. So you can see here, if I click on this, it's picked up that there's whole numbers in here, which is pretty much correct. If I go to customer ID, it's picked up that we have text in here, which again, pretty much correct. And you can change these if you feel the need to. And I would do a quick visual check as you go across and just make any formatting changes just by clicking and selecting in your columns. Okay, so that can make a big difference when you're putting it into your Power Pivot table. Does that make sense so far? I can see this little chat panel blinking away. I'm sorry, it's so difficult for me to check this as I'm going through. Let's have a look. I think there's people just having conversations amongst themselves. I can't actually see any questions in there, so I'm going to minimize that for the time being. I can see a question blinking away in the Q&A, which I will get to at the end, so just bear with me. All right, so we're pretty much ready. As I said, there are so many more things that you could do in this Power Query window, and I would advise you to kind of go through and check out some more detailed information either on our courses or online if you want to. I'm going to go through and we're going to start to create a Power Pivot table. I'm going to show you how you can create relationships between data and all of those kinds of fun things as well. So before I do that, I'm going to give my table, my entire table, a name. And again, over on the right-hand side where we have our applied steps, just above we have a little properties area. And this is just where you can name the data set that you're using. So I'm just going to call this sales data and hit enter like so. I'm going to jump to my home ribbon, and once you are happy with the way that your Power Query window looks or your data looks, you can click this close and load button, and I'm going to select close and load to. And again, this can take a few seconds. All right, so now it's asking me, where do I want to import that data to? So I have numerous different options. I could import it into a table, pivot table, pivot chart. What I'm going to say is only create connection. And I'm also going to say, add this to data model. So basically those three files that I have, I'm creating a connection between Excel and those three files, and we're going to create this thing called a data model, which is kind of sits in the background. And what it means is that I have those three files in this data model, and I can add more and more files to the data model for Excel to use in one pivot table. Okay, so I'm going to click on OK, and this always confuses me because it always looks like it's done nothing. So it goes away. And you'll see you get down the side here. So at the bottom, it's telling me it's imported 6,299 rows of sales data. Okay. Now, apart from this little notification in this panel, I can't actually see anything on the screen at the moment. So how do I look at that data? Well, I'm going to go to my Power Pivot ribbon. And I'm going to go into Manage Data Model. And this opens up another window, which is the Power Pivot for Excel window. And this is now showing me all of my sales data, and it's showing me in a nice organized columns and rows. And again, I get a whole host of options that I can utilize in here. Okay, so this is going to be my three files that are combined. Now, what I'm going to do is, in order to get a complete picture of my data, if I look at the data that I have, I mean, it's fairly good. I can see things like the customer ID, but I don't really have any other customer information. I can also see things like the SKU. This is basically the product number, but I don't really have any other details about the product in this data. Now, if I just minimize this for a moment and go back to those 4 tables we were looking at the beginning, you can see here I have product number, but I also have the category for that product. In this table, I have the customer number, but I also have a little bit further information about those customers. And the same thing for ship mode, order priority. So I basically have more information contained in these 4 tables. So what I might want to do is import this information into my Power Pivot, so I can then utilize this information as well. Okay, so it's very simple. And as I said, I have these on one worksheet. You might have these in different files entirely. Same principle applies. You just click in the table, and then from the Power Pivot ribbon, you select Add to Data Model, and it will add that to that data model that kind of sits in the background. So if you imagine at the moment in the data model, we have those 3 original sales files, and I'm about to add another table of data to that data model just by clicking Add to Data Model. And it will go away, and you can see now that it's brought in a new tab with that information. So I have my original sales data, and now I have another tab with that information in there. I'm going to do the same thing for this table, and I'm going to click Add to Data Model. And it's going to do exactly the same, and it's going to pull that information in like so. Now, what I might want to do, as I said, I want to know a little bit more about our customers. So I have my customer ID, and now if I click on, I think it's this one here, customer, I have the customer ID in here, but I also can tell from this table what state they're in by the state code and also the actual state. So I might want to create some links between my sales data, so this customer ID, and the data in this customer table, okay? And we can do that a lot easier if we look at our data in diagram view. So if you look at your Power Pivot ribbons, in the last group, we have an option for diagram view. And this is where you can come to create relationships between different columns on different tables, okay? How you arrange these is up to you. Now, I generally tend to like to have my main data, which is this big one, the sales data, at the top. I like to make it a bit bigger so I can see. And then any sort of sub-tables or smaller tables, I will kind of organize underneath. That's just how I like to do it, because I just find it's a little bit more organized. And this is where you can create relationships. So I might want to say, wherever I have my customer ID, I want to link it to the rest of the customer information in this table. And all you do to link is click on customer ID and drag down to customer down here. And that creates a little link between those 2 tables. I could do the same for the SKU or the product number. So I have the SKU here, but maybe I want to be able to reference the information, the further information we have in this table down here. So I can click and drag like so. And that's going to create links between those pieces of data. Okay, I could carry on doing the same thing. So if I go back to data view, just by clicking on the data view button, I can go back to here, and maybe I want to import these. So I'm going to click and I'm going to add to data model. And that's pulled that one through. And then maybe I want to do the final one as well, add to data model. So hopefully you can see that if you've got data which really kind of gives you a better overview of the original source data, you can pull that in and have lots of different tables and then create one pivot table based off of all of these different tables, which is kind of the whole point of this exercise, which we're going to do in a moment. So if I minimize that down, oh, sorry, didn't want to do that. I want to go back there. like so. So if we switch back to diagram view, you can see I now have these two in here, which I could then organize, and I can start linking through if I wanted to. You don't have to link. I'm just showing you how you can create relationships between different columns and different sets of data. Okay, and I'm going to switch back to data view like so. All right, so how do we build one pivot table based on all of this data? Well, let's minimize down. And I'm going to go to, do I have a blank sheet somewhere? Let's do a brand new blank sheet. I'm going to go to insert, and I'm going to go to pivot table. In fact, before I do that, let me just close that down so we're not too crowded. I'm going to insert a pivot table in the normal way, but this time, instead of using a table or a range as my data for my pivot table, I'm going to select use this workbooks data model. So the pivot table is going to look at any information you've added into that data model. Okay, so we should have in there our first three files that we selected, the sales 2014, 2015, 2016, and also those additional tables, those 4 tables that we added into our data model. So all of that information should come through. So I'm going to select use this workbooks data model, and we're going to put it on a new worksheet, and we're going to select OK. And you see now, if we look over at the right hand side, it's pulled through everything, all of that data, which I can then utilize in my pivot table. So maybe I want to take, let's see, the product number and put it in filters so that I can filter for the different product numbers. Maybe I want to take the customer from here and put that into columns. It's not particularly nice. Let's move that to rows. Maybe I want to have, let's see, the sales amount in values. And you can really go to town on how you want it to look. And you can then utilize any of the column headings from multiple tables and add them into your data model, which makes it a really nice and easy way of combining a lot of data. Once you have your data here, and I'm just going to remove some of these because I don't particularly like the customer one, is a bit long. Let's do state in rows instead. So we've got a little bit of information in there, and you can then go through, and once you've got your data looking how you want, you can then go through and start creating pivot charts or whatever it is that you want to create. You can start doing interactive dashboards, all based on this data. All right, so that's kind of the basics of using Power Query to import data, using that Power Query editor window to make some changes to your data. And as I said, there's a whole host of things that you can do in there, and then how you can kind of utilize all of that, how you can add to the data model, tables of data from different sources, and then you can create one Power Pivot table based on all of those fields. That's pretty much what I was going to show you today. As I said, if we were to go any further into this, it's going to start getting really, really complicated and complex. And I think if you're not used to this, this is a good kind of starting block to get you thinking about the data that you use and the kinds of things you might want to use it for. So I'm just quickly going to jump across to the chat panel. And let's see if we've got any questions. There's quite a lot of questions coming in. How do you create the Power Pivot again? So, okay, let me go back. So the Power Pivot, once you've got all your data added to the data model, you come back to Excel and come onto a blank sheet, and you basically just do a regular pivot table. So you would go to Insert, Pivot Table, and then instead of selecting a table range or anything like that, you would just make sure that you've got this selected. Use this workbooks data model. So as long as you've added those tables to the data model, this is the option you want to use, and that will create your Power Pivot table, essentially. Hopefully that answers your question. Let's have a look. Sorry, there's so many. I'm just going to scroll up. Hi, is this webinar being recorded? It is being recorded, and it will come out to you 24 hours after this webinar ends. One question, how to deal with data in different formats? Yeah, the data has to be fairly consistent that you're using, but you can, it doesn't have to be exactly the same. You can see that we've utilized different tables, but if you're talking about data that's inconsistent within each table, you do have to make sure that your data is consistent, as in you have all of text in one column and numbers in one column, and there's no blank rows, and that's where you would come into the cleaning of your data prior to doing any of this. And as I said, I'll show you at the end a webinar that we did on how you can clean raw data. So yes, you do have to kind of clean up your data first before doing any of this. Let's have a look. Some people are confused by the date. Yes, it's UK date format. Sorry for error. US customers and people in other parts of the world, it's a British format. We write the dates slightly different to you guys. We think you write it backwards, but I'm sure you think that we write it backwards. Lovely. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through to see if we have any other things. Let me scroll down. Someone's put, can you show me where to find the data in Excel again? I have the 2016 version and it's not the same as yours. I'm assuming you mean this get on the data ribbon. This over here, this is the part which can change from version to version. But if you're using 2016, it should look fairly similar to mine. As I said, you might have a button that doesn't say get data. It might say something like transform or get and transform. But if you click it and you can see sort of options that look like this, that's the button you want. Yeah, that's all I can tell you on that one, really. Someone's put, that's a lot of info to digest. I know, it really is, isn't it? It's in such a short space of time. Someone's put, can you make your data available for us to work with? I absolutely can. So what I'll do, and this is probably a good point for me to bring up the next steps slide, so you know what's going on. So as I mentioned, the recording of this webinar and the practice files, so what I'm using, the spreadsheets that I'm using, will be sent out to you in 24 to 48 hours. It's 24 hours. It goes out. It's automated. It's not something I send. It's automated by the system, and it will all go out this time tomorrow. You will have it. Okay. As I said, if you're still sitting there tomorrow evening and you can't, you haven't got the email, please, in the first instance, can you check your spam, junk, and clutter folders? If you've moved emails from us before into junk or clutter, then the systems, email systems are smart these days. They will continue to move emails from that email address to your clutter folder. So please make sure that you check those and move them out of clutter in order to make sure that you receive those going forward. So yes, if you still have checked your spam folder and you still don't have it, then please do send me an email. I'll give you my email address and I will forward the files onto you. Now, historical recordings, we get this all the time, and as I mentioned, we are in the process of doing a big upload to YouTube at the moment. It's still not quite ready to go live, so for the time being, our past webinars are available on that URL at the bottom, so excelwithbusiness.com/live-classes, and that is where you'll find our, we have, I think we have pivot table webinars on there, we have cleaning data on there as well, so if you want to review any of those, that's a free resource, so you can go on there and take a look at those. As I said, soon they will all be on YouTube, and so you can save them to playlists and things like that, because we do listen to you what you want, and that was one of the big things that people said. And just in case you want to speak to me about this webinar, or if you happen to not get the files by this time tomorrow, then please feel free to drop me an email at deborah.ashby@filtered.com. And if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, you can search for me, Deborah Ashby. I should pop up straight away, I think. Slightly different picture, but hopefully you'll recognize me. So please, again, do feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. And that is pretty much all the information I wanted to give you. A little bit shorter than normal, this webinar. And as I said, if this is a subject that you really enjoyed, then I would definitely delve into it a little bit more. But hopefully it kind of gives you an idea, for those of you that had no clue, at least some of the things that you can do with it. All right, so I'm going to say goodbye now. If you've got a burning question that I haven't answered, again, if you can send it through to me via email. It's just very difficult for me to see with all of these different comments scrolling up. So please just send it through via email and I'll come back to you as soon as I can. But thank you very much, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye.